James.
You mentioned the universality of the Catholic Church. I mean, that's what the word Catholic ultimately means. One of the things that I was struck by was, and in fact I've noticed, in attending churches and masses in Australia, is that many of the priests are from the Philippines, they're from Africa, and I saw a number of cardinals from around the world. Tell us about the prospects of where the next pope might come from. There are people like Cardinal Sarah, who is older, I think he's 79, so possibly too old for it, but very doctrinally sound and one of the best thinkers and theologians, I think, that we have around living today. Tell us about the growth of the church in these places like Africa and South America, and where that sort of new vibrancy is coming from for the church, that may in places like Australia or in Europe, mass attendance is down, faithfulness is down, and of course, there are other competing, shall we say, other faiths coming to the fore.
Yeah, and James, you're absolutely right. Someone like Cardinal Sarah from Africa is seen as someone who has great intellectual wattage. He is one of the intellectual heavyweights in the College of Cardinals, I would say. And, look at our countries, Ireland and Australia. My country, even though just a population of a couple of million people, we were a factory producing priests and nuns for years. We evangelized Africa, Asia. We sent priests to Australia and to the United States. The tide has now turned. In fact, people say the future is Africa, the future is Asia. That's not right. It's now. And what I really notice is that people try and talk about, the conservative, more traditional side of the Catholic Church. And they always fall back on the Americans. And they say, oh, the American conservatives, as if this is some kind of fringe group in the church. That could not be further from the truth. Last year, I went to Kenya and Uganda. I interviewed the Bishop of Nairobi, and he said, Colm, we have a similar problem. You're from Ireland, you have a crisis of vocations, because we don't have any seminarians in our seminaries. He said, we have a crisis of vocations here too. I said, what? He said, we have too many, and we don't know where to put them. They are now exporting them right around the world. And remember, they come from countries that have more traditional values. Their priorities are not the kind of things that have been discussed at the synod here, maybe some of the places that Pope Francis put an emphasis on over his papacy. They need to build schools, they need to build hospitals, they need to build roads, they need to feed their people. In fact, I'd go even further than that. In some places like Ghana, I interviewed a group of sisters, and I said, they were there in their habits, and they looked very sweet. And I said, what do you do, sisters? Thinking that they were going to say they pray in the convent. And they said, we work out in the rural areas, rescuing children who their parents believe have been cursed by witchcraft if they're born with special needs or disabilities. This happens today, and this is what the church has to deal with. So I think in Africa, when you're looking to the future, in this upcoming conclave, they want to see those values, those family values, those truthful values, the gospel. They want to see that not only reflected in the Catholic Church, but they want to see it supported by the church and promoted by the Catholic Church. So that is why I think this is going to shape up to be a very interesting conclave this time around.
Well, you talked about Pope Francis's complicated legacy, and he did lean into all sorts of issues that you wouldn't expect the Pope to lean into, like global warming, at a time where Christians were being persecuted in many parts of the world. How will he be ultimately remembered? What do you think his legacy will be?
You know, Rita, how they say a legacy is in the eye of a beholder, and people much smarter than I will debate this for years. But the interesting thing about that is, on one hand, he did focus a lot on the environment. Now, as Christians, we believe we do have a responsibility to look after this gift from God. We have to be good stewards of this land. But, I was listening to your discussion before we came on air, and the problem with the Pope Francis papacy sometimes for, practicing Catholics, and I don't want to even say conservative, because people use that as a way to diminish them or demean them, but people who were just serious about their faith, believed what they preached. The Pope always reached out to the LGBT community. He made it more welcoming and more accepting on one hand. But then on the other hand, he said just last year that gender ideology was the greatest evil of our time. I remember standing outside the Basilica reporting on that. Now, the problem with his legacy and with his reputation, I think he was misrepresented because, as you know, a lot of media outlets, when they hear a phrase like the Pope saying, "Who am I to judge?" It's the front page of the New York Times, it's leading all the news bulletins. But when he says look, we should be more welcoming, but the sacrament of marriage remains and will never change. It will be between a man and a woman. That doesn't really go as viral or doesn't get picked up. So I think sometimes Francis, he wasn't much different than Pope Benedict when you really read what they said, but certainly his tone was different, and that was what got him his legacy and reputation that he has today.
Colm Flynn, thanks so much for talking to us from Rome. There's lots more we could chat about, China and the Pope and so on, but we've got to leave it there. But thank you for telling us all about that and those insights there. Fantastic stuff.